Uniting both the art and the science of functional medicine. Here's your host, Dr. Brad Watts.
Nutrition heroes, welcome to the podcast today. Thank you for tuning in. This is Dr. Brad Watts, and I'm in the podcast lab as always. A couple of things, some general announcements, if we can call it that. A couple of things that I'm very thankful for. Number one, my wife and I had a little boy last Thursday, and by we, I mean she did all the work. I was just there holding her hand. And so little Theodore, we're calling him Teddy, was born, and super excited to have him in the family. And so he's our third child. I think he's going to be the last one that we have by natural means. And so anyway, super excited about it. Glad to have him. And he's getting used to us. We're getting used to him. And it's a cool little dance that happens. But that's exciting. And then secondly, today, I have a guest. His name is Dr. Rick Jacoby. He is one of the leading surgeons in the United States that deals specifically with peripheral nerves. I'm excited to talk to him because I'm a chiropractor. He's a surgeon. And one of the things that he gets excited about is that the chiropractors, right, like our heritage, were correct, right? He has there's this thing in medicine called the double crush theory, which he's going to talk about, I'm sure, coming up. And this double crush is basically nerve impingement, right? And so as a chiropractor, we talk about nerve pressure and stuff. And all. He says it's both mechanical and chemical. His book called Sugar Crush is a very interesting read. And so this guy is a stream of consciousness all his own. What a wonderful guest. And I appreciate him taking his time, being able to drop some knowledge with us today. And then certainly you can find him at the links below this podcast. So without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Jacoby. And welcome to the Nutrition Hero Podcast, Dr. Jacoby. I appreciate you being here today.
My pleasure.
I'm excited to dig in with you here. I know you have a book that we're going to talk about called Sugar Crush. Great title, by the way. And we're going to be talking about nutrition and neuropathy and some of the things that are in your world right now. But I hope in the consumer world, everybody's coming up as far as human cell and tissue products, regen therapy, that type of thing. Kind of excited about it. So anyway, where would you like to start today? I would like to start with your book, if that's okay.
That's perfect. I love my book, and thank you for the introduction. And we're recording here from sunny downtown Scottsdale, by the way, Scottsdale, Arizona. The book is really a compilation of all the things I learned in podiatric medicine, but more specifically, it is a compilation of what I was taught by Dr. Lee Dellon, who is a professor of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins about 20 years ago. Is really a transformational point in my training because he had a unique and very controversial application of diabetic neuropathy in surgery. And the neurology world was very much against it. There's a fellow at Mayo Clinic. His name is Peter Dick, of all names. I hate to say that, but that's his name. And but he's the world's leading authority on neuropathy. And he wrote a textbook on peripheral neuropathy. And he was really very much opposed and says that in his book that Lee Dellon's method of decompressing nerves is very dangerous. And this is back about year 2000. So I studied with Dellon. I knew of that controversy. I was running the Scottsdale Healthcare's wound care center at the time, and I brought that concept back to Scottsdale. And in the process of doing that, we had miraculous changes in people who had diabetic ulcers, diabetic neuropathy, and lots of other types of neuropathy as well. And through that process, I came to realize that this is really a transformational procedure in reducing amputations, but the hospital and the medical community was not too thrilled about that. I made, I think, the mistake of saying to Dr. Dellon, I think there's more to your theory. And he said, well, why don't you figure it out? Well, I said, that's a daunting path. Now here's a fellow that is a full professor of neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins, and I'm going to teach him something? I don't think so. But I took the challenge, and I didn't take it as against him, but I I was thinking, as my training was pretty focused on diabetic ulcerations and podiatric surgery. And I thought, well, you know, I don't really know what's out there, so let's start digging into the literature. And I did. And one of the early subjects I found was a fellow up at Stanford. His name is John Cook. If you want to look that up, it's with an E, C-O-O-K-E. John is a cardiologist by training, and he ran the Cook Laboratory, vascular laboratory at Harvard and Mayo Clinic prior, and then he went to Stanford and followed up on Gerald Raven's work, who is the inventor of the metabolic syndrome, or at least tagged that word to it, and later became insulin resistance, and as we know, the science today. So John is a very bright guy, but he said to me when this is how I contacted him. This is one of those, if your audience is out there, you want to pursue something. These real scientists, and I'm not a scientist, I'm just a clinician. I text him and I said, I read your article in Circulation. This is 2004. And he had written an article called The Uber Marker, Asymmetric Dimethylarginine as the Uber Marker. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if that has anything to do with Dellen's theory. And I texted him, I said, I've been studying with Dellen. He has a theory, and you have a theory, and I have a theory. I wonder if they have anything to do with each other. 1 hour later, he called me on the phone. And he said, that's pretty interesting. Why don't you come up to Stanford, which I did. And then I learned what he was telling me about his molecule. And now remember, this is 2004, so the Nobel Prize for nitric oxide wasn't given until 97. So most of Dellen's work was done without that knowledge. So long story short, I went up there. We started to test my patients with diabetic neuropathy, and we found, we put them in 5 different quintiles, 5 different groups. And in the upper group, and I remember the number is 0.47 of asymmetric dimethylarginine. Now, what does that word really mean? Well, it means it's the naturally occurring arginine molecule that's been asymmetrical, pushed the methyl group to the opposite side. It blocks the nitric oxide pathway. And I thought that probably had something to do with the vasa vasorum, the blood supply to the nerve, which it does. So that's how I got into the book issue. And then I'll tell you how that all interrelates to all these other neuropathies and metabolic syndrome, and how this is so pervasive in our culture and our diet.
Absolutely.
So that's how.
All right. So when did you publish the book, by the way?
I published the book in 2015.
Okay.
So I had this kernel of thought back in 2004 when I met Cook.
Yeah.
So I took that concept of asymmetric dimethylarginine, and we can shorten that up to ADMA if you like.
Sure.
A lot easier to say, ADMA. So I went back to Dr. Cook, and this was about 2009, and I said, look at this data. And there was a cluster of other neuropathies that high levels of ADMA. And in that cluster, in the 5th quintile, there were diseases such as MS, ocular neuropathy, temporal arteritis, etc. And I said, gee, that's kind of interesting. He thought it was interesting. He said, why don't you shut your practice down, come up, work with me, and we'll try to figure this out. I said, well, that would be nice, and I like rats, and I work on rats when I was in undergraduate school. And in chemistry, and I do like that, but to tell you the truth, it's kind of boring because it takes 4 or 5 years to prove one molecule.
Right.
And then it has to be published, and somebody has to read it. Well, I'm not that person.
Sure.
So I tell you what, I'll write a book, and that's what Sugar Crush is about. And this is really, I think, the answer to metabolic disease and all the neuropathies. And we'll segue over to what my new project is, and that's regenerative medicine. And in that world of regenerative medicine is the concept of stem cells. And that's a very controversial, very powerful, and I think probably the greatest discovery since the germ theory, because it doesn't, it can, I don't know if I want to use the word cure. That's the closest thing we have to it. Allopathic approach of arresting the symptoms does not cure anything.
Right.
Except for maybe infectious disease, but certainly not chronic disease. And that's what we're talking about. So chiropractic is interesting how it interfaces with this concept. Now, Dr. Dellon is a neurosurgeon, and he uses the concept of double crush. And in osteopathic medicine, they call that a lesion. I believe in chiropractic, you talk about nerve compression. So everybody's using a little bit different language, but they're absolutely the same process from a mechanical standpoint. So what I did hopefully I explained it well in Sugar Crush, is blending the two concepts of mechanical compression and biochemical compression of a nerve. So the controversial world of chiropractic, a lot of people say they can cure this and cure that. Well, it's actually true. It really is. Let's take MS, because we looked at that in the studies up at Stanford. MS is a nerve compression, in my opinion, of the vagus nerve by both a biochemical reaction, and we'll get into the chemistry in a few seconds here,
Sure.
and a mechanical outcome. Now, how does that work? Well, obviously, if your body's out of alignment, you're going to have mechanical compression. But if you're eating a diet that's high in sugar, and in the book, I talk about that history and how we came to that to be, and how, and my new book is going to hopefully explain it a little better. So I know we don't have a lot of time, but let me just segue over to the concept of how allopathic medicine got to this point in time that is trying to create a drug. And I have nothing wrong with that, but it's not going to cure anything, but it does make a lot of money. And we have to, so all the research from NIH is to find a molecule that can slow a inflammatory process down. If you can do that, you're going to make it, you're going to get a patent, and you're going to make a lot of money. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're trying to look to the root cause of all these biochemical and biomechanical nerve compressions. Okay, here's the deep dive in that story. So let's go back to roughly the 1600s. And America was, let's go back to the 1400s. America was basically founded on sugar. Columbus went to Isabella and Ferdinand and said, I got a deal for you. I have some maps. If you fund it, I'll find it. And he did. And he brought sugar to the New World. They planted sugar in the West Indies. And here we are today with a society that really is based on sugar. But in the 1600s, sugar was $1,000 a pound in England. $1,000.
What?
Because it was very expensive to transport, manufacture, and the rich, they're the only ones who could eat sugar. And guess what? They're the only ones that had any disease.
That's right.
Because the poor weren't eating sugar, they couldn't afford it. But the rich could. And the rich could afford doctors to treat their disease. Now, this is supposition, obviously, on my part. But if you look through the literature, and I did, and the first guy was Thomas Willis. Thomas Willis, who is supposedly the father of neurology. And he still has his picture of the circle of Willis, the circulation in the base of the brain.
Yeah.
Sketched by Christopher Wren, by the way, who was the architect of the London Bridge. Find that fascinating. Still, that picture is still in Gray's Anatomy. But this was their thought process. They observed what they saw and with their human eyes. And we started to get microscopes. And then we did a deeper dive, really, what they were doing. So a guy like Charcot came along and said, hey, look at these spots on the brain, as he did a dissection. And he said, well, let's call that multiple areas of sclerosis. What a brilliant observation. That's not a disease. That's an observation. So those little scarred things you see on the brain and the cervical spine, they started to develop the concept of autoimmune. The body was attacking their own cells. Well, they were, but they never got into cause. So look at all the different diseases, the 1800s in particular. And I think the reason is because they had a camera then. If you see those classic photographs from the Civil War and they look like they're really miserable, well, that's because it took 20 minutes for the exposure of the light to hit the glass slide and the chemical emulsion. So you had to hold perfectly still for 20 minutes. Now, here we are on an iPhone, and it's instant. That was transformational. So guys like Charcot, he named it MS, and that became a disease. No, it's not. ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. The next nerve over in the neck, 9, glossopharyngeal nerve. And so everybody was getting their name on things. Morton in my field, Morton's neuroma. That's a mechanical plus biochemical reaction to the interdigital nerve, and it causes certain symptoms. So my theory is that, and I call it the global compression theory, is all nerves throughout the body, no matter what you call them, all have the same process of a compression by mechanical and metabolic. Now, I think you probably could get a nerve compression if you're hit by a meteorite. I think that could happen. Maybe if you got run over a car, certainly that happens. But when 80% of all the food that we eat in the United States has high fructose corn syrup in it, I think that's the pervasive common denominator.
Doctor,
so how does that work?
This is really interesting. This is good. Keep going. I just wanted to throw that in there.
Okay. I mean, I get death threats. I do. I mean, I get real controversial. And this is not popular in the pharmaceutical world.
Sure.
So this is what I learned from Dr. Dellon. The two, and he started with the double crush syndrome. Are you familiar with that syndrome, by the way?
Yes.
Double crush? Mm-hmm. Okay, so for our audience, that is really from Upton McComas' theory. In 1973, they published this in Lancet. And what it means is if you have a compression on your carpal tunnel in the median nerve, and it doesn't produce any symptoms, if you have a secondary compression in the brachial plexus, then that summates or adds up to have enough compression to produce pain. They did a study and published in 73 that if they decompressed one nerve, the other area pain went away, double crush. And that is really why the book is called Sugar Crush, because they noted that sugar was present in 16% of those cases, and that was the additional crush. So how does sugar work as a crush? First one is the Polyol Pathway. And in the biochemistry world, that means that sugar will convert down to sorbitol, and sorbitol is an alcohol sugar inside the nerve, and it's very hydrophilic. In other words, it pulls water into the inner structure of the nerve, and it swells the nerve. Number two, the Maillard reaction. And I get criticized for that pronunciation, by the way. It's a French word, means milieu. But, I'm originally from Philadelphia, and I have to say Maillard, just like water.
Right.
So, but it does, people say, well, how do you apply a cooking term to nerves? Well, the Maillard reaction is a cooking term. It means sugar plus a protein goes through a process, shift base, and those molecules get a little closer. So connective tissue around the nerve and inside the nerve are getting smaller. Now, I don't think it takes that much visualization to say if you have a nerve that's getting bigger and a soft tissue around it that's getting smaller, I think we call that word compression.
I think that's right.
I think it is. And then you add malalignment of the structure, the osseous structures, then you have a fibro-osseous compression. So that's Dellon's theory in a nutshell. So in the 80s, a patient that he had operated on for carpal tunnel, who was diabetic, said to him, "Why don't you fix my feet?" And he said, "Well, that's not done. That's a different disease." And he thought about it, and he went, And he's a real scientist. This guy is off the charts. 2 textbooks on neurosurgery, probably 500 articles, 55 chapters, and he's the real deal. I studied with him. He's telling me all this stuff. Why doesn't the rest of the world know this? Well, they like drugs like Lyrica, gabapentin. You know the drugs. Yep. They don't do anything to the nerve. They work in your brain so you don't feel what's going on. Very powerful drug and very profitable. And your process continues on if you're eating sugar. So I think a very dangerous drug too, because it's like turning off the fire alarm in your house, and you got a smoke detector, right, and you're sleeping. It's going to catch on fire, and you're going to die. You have to realize this sugar is a poison, and specifically high fructose corn syrup. And if you continue eating it, you're going to have every itis the world has ever identified.
That's right.
I mean, it's almost silly.
Yeah.
So continuing on, so that's where I entered the story, and I said, "Dr. Dillon, I think there's more to this." Well, there is more to that. ADMA, asymmetric dimethylarginine, is that missing ingredient. But it's hard to identify, and it's hard to correlate with nerve conduction. You can't, because I think ADMA operates in the autonomic nervous system, which is the first compressive item. If you put it as an item. So I did a continuum. Now this is back in 2004, and I'm dealing with literally Nobel laureates. So I bring that concept to Dillon at Hopkins, and he said, "Well, small fiber and large fiber are separate and distinct diseases, like Tangier's disease." Well, there's 50 people in the world have Tangier's disease, and I see small fiber neuropathy every day. I think it's a continuum. There's a fellow by the name of Aaron Vinnick. He agrees with this continuum, but he doesn't agree with the large fiber that Dillon's talking about. But he thinks there are compressions. So we have 2 opposing forces. I stepped in the middle of this argument. I think they're both right. Autonomic neuropathy is the early phase, and you can track it with a biochemical marker such as ADMA. But that's really not the real story of what I'm talking about. So I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about it, but let's talk about stem cells.
Yes.
Now, stem cells, I think they've been around for a while, don't you think? Which came first, the chicken or the stem cell?
Right. No joke.
I mean, all this is new, it's controversial. No, it's not. I mean, that's why we're here. Right. Stem cells, and that's another word, mesenchymal stem cells, or as some people like to call them, mesenchymal stem cells. We'll call them MSCs, because the new term is medicinal signaling cells. Okay? And I like that because I think it explains the process a little better. So what does sugar have to do with any of this? Well, it's interesting. If your ADMA levels are high, if you want to use stem cell as a treatment, you're going to have less effect, because ADMA is a very inflammatory marker. Matter of fact, it's 3 times more specific than CRP, which is the current use of the marker for inflammation. So I was just up at the Perinatal Stem Cell Society meeting in Utah about 6 weeks ago, which is the new term for this whole industry. And it almost sounds like you're an obstetrician. Perinatal stem cell. Well, what's that mean? It's really a good term, because we're talking about non-embryonic stem cells, adult stem cells. So in other words, a full-term pregnancy and that physiology that surrounds that event. So from a C-section, you're really saying to the patient, are you going to use that material, yes or no? And they can donate that to a laboratory where it's frozen and processed and delivered. And you can get that right now. A lot of FDA concern and, all the stuff in the politics. But does it work? Absolutely. I mean, I can't say even more than absolutely, because it's the most transformational thing we have. It's going to replace drugs. Well, that's caused another firestorm. Well, we need more research. That means that's code for we need more money.
That's right.
You're right. So let's talk about perinatal tissue. So we have the amniotic fluid, we have the placenta and the chorion, which is the lining, and we have the umbilical cord. Inside is the hematopoietic blood components, and the outside is the connective tissue, which is called Wharton's jelly.
Mm-hmm.
So I like words and names, and so I thought, why is it called Wharton's jelly? So do a deep dive on that one. John Wharton, 1653. Now you have to kind of wonder what was John fooling around with connective tissue and umbilical cords?
Right.
I don't know, but it's interesting. 1653. So they have probably most of the MSCs in that tissue.
Mm-hmm.
Then we get into another controversy. Do you really need MSCs to do the heavy lifting, or is it all the trophic factors, as we call them, which are all the growth factors? And I think there's probably 400 of them named now. And ironically, VEGF is one of the most powerful ones. And that's the molecule that John Cook was working on at Stanford. And this is way back. And now John left Stanford and is at the Tabeki Institute in Houston with Baylor. And he is the number one investigator for stem cells in the United States. So he's taken all this knowledge we talked about, and he's doing what's called the inducible pluripotent mesenchymal stem cell research. And what does that mean? It means you can take the genes, unravel them, and one of the genes, I think is interesting, you can remember it, SOX, and that particular gene, when it's isolated, can grow new tissue.
Sure.
And that Nobel Prize was just given a couple of years ago. So the industry is moving very rapidly to making new body parts. So let's talk about John Cook's work.
Sure.
So he can put a catheter inside the heart where it's MI, what is an MI? It's really just scar tissue. Lack of blood supply, get an infarct, and you have repair, you have fibrosis, scar tissue. Go inside, take that out, put it in a petri dish, take the genes apart, and before you know it, you had the beating of a myocyte injected back in the heart, and you have a new heart.
Cool.
That's going to be done for everything.
Yeah.
So what do and how do immunologic tissue work? Number one, and this is Dr. Reardon's thought, and that's a great book, by the way, and I visited with him last weekend in his clinic in Dallas, Texas, and talked to all his research scientists. So boil down this extremely complicated subject to three things. It is modulated through the immune system, okay, which is physiology we already know, and two functions. It reduces inflammation and it reduces scar tissue. So circle back to all your forefathers in chiropractic medicine. They were right. Absolutely. Not kind of, maybe. Absolutely. Combine biomechanics with biochemistry, and that's the answer. And MS, ALS, autism, that's the hypoglossal nerve, comes down under the chin, innervates what? A muscle. If you have delayed speech, you can't speak. Joanne Kurtzberg, tell me how much time we have left, because I can talk forever.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Okay. So Joanne Kurtzberg up at, or down at Duke, got a grant, and she looked at cerebral palsy, muscular dystrophy, and autism. Gave them cord blood, allogenic, meaning another kid's blood, from the perinatal event, and injected these kids that had diseases. I may have it on my desk here if I can find it. Such a mess here today. Anyway, I'll find it. But take my word for it. she looked at diseases, and I'll throw these out because these are diseases I guarantee you've never seen, but you probably heard of them. Fabry's disease. Have you heard that one?
I've heard of it. Never seen it.
Maillard's disease.
Mm-hmm.
Tay-Sachs. These are metabolic problems in infancy. And she gave them cord blood. And guess what? They all lived. She testified before the Senate committee on this subject of stem cells, non-embryonic stem cells, in the year 2003. That's 16 years ago. This is not new science. Now, why doesn't everybody know this?
No joke.
Well, this is really a criminal, I think, a problem. This should be front page news. We're talking about autism, MS, any disease you can think of. And all the scientists that were at the meeting in Utah used one word that was common to every lecture, from meningomyocele to spina bifida to MS to autism, was inflammation. And back to the original thesis, what causes inflammation? Meteorites? Maybe. Or sugar? Probably.
Right.
And specifically, high fructose corn syrup. And the chemistry behind it supports it. And you know what? Here's another thing. Stem cells, ironically, do not speak English. Did you know that?
No.
They don't. So they wouldn't know if you had MS. They go to where the inflammation is. They look at the mitochondria. If they don't think it's good, they shoot it and kill it. Apoptosis, think it's salvageable.
Yeah.
They interject their own mitochondria and they make the tissue better. That's how it works. It's that simple.
I was talking with one of the directors, the chief science officer at this place called Predictive Biotech in Utah. And
yes,
well, if you're familiar with them, and he said that the number one thing that happens if somebody's inflamed is those stem cells. You can put them in a knee, but they're going to migrate. They're going to end up in the gut where all the inflammation is, trying to suppress it. So, and it's interesting. So
yeah, they're signaling molecules. That's all they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they've been doing it for, a couple billion years. So they got a good track record, and they got there without FDA approval, by the way. Yeah. Isn't that ironic?
Yeah.
Yeah. So stem cells, I mean, how did they get through the FDA and USDA? I mean,
wow.
Yeah.
So
biology is in.
With what you're working on right now, what's one message that you would leave for the providers that are in the nutrition world? And I think I know what you're going to say, but what's one message that you would leave for them with your entire background? Because you have a sordid history, and let's put it this way. You have a big container and a cool retrieval system to be able to walk through dates and names like that. So what's one thing that you would leave us with today?
Well, it's real simple. You know the answer, don't eat sugar. Ketogenic diet. That whole process of, cholesterol and statin drugs is nonsense. And I asked that to Cook. Why are we being taught this? Well, you know the answer. And it's a misnomer. Back to the 1800s, Burkal, he opened up an artery and he looked at it and said, what's this crap? And he literally did. And he named it atherosclerosis. You know what that means? Athero means gunk in Greek. And sclerosis is hardened gunk in the artery. Now, is that a diagnosis or an observation of a process?
That's right.
And then lots of experiments with rats, and the Russians got involved. And maybe this is the Russian collusion. I don't know. And they injected rabbits with cholesterol. Of course, rabbits are vegetarians,
Sure.
But they based that on that. And then the big pharma came in and said, hey, we'll make a drug. Statin drugs to reduce cholesterol, which has nothing to do with heart disease. Heart disease is sugar. I asked Dr. Cook that. First thing I asked him, I said, what's the deal? And I have the advantage of doing that, cut through the 700 papers you wrote. I did read them, but it's a 101. He said, well, it's easy. The endothelium, the lining of the blood vessels, is smooth as, at his words, Teflon. You add sugar, it gets inflamed, gets like Velcro. Signaling molecule is cholesterol. It comes to repair. So Burkell, when you looked at it, he didn't know. He didn't have what knowledge we have. He made an observation, but it's stuck in the literature, and it's confused the whole thing. It's sugar. It's eat good fat, ketogenic diet. That's the trick. Period. I mean, well, there's no money in that sentence.
Right.
None. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Doc, I appreciate you taking time to be on the podcast today, number one. And number two, to be able to blend knowledge and humor. That's pretty good. That's a good job on your part. So.
Well, I'm old, you know.
There you go. So.